I'm here with my esteemed colleague Joseph Cox, who is writing for the English motherboard channels, covering cybersecurity, darknet stuff, hacking topics, has seen a lot of data breaches and has been reporting this stuff for years now. And to my left is Thomas Reed, professor in security studies at King's College London. Actually, you studied in Berlin.
Right, yes.
You're a political scientist, also a historian, but also historian on disinformation, information campaigns, active measures. But you have also been digging through quite recent stuff and researching recent data breaches. So really at the intersection of what we will be touching on today, which is politics and technology, data breaches. The way we're going to do it is I am going to be moderating this. I'm the editor-in-chief for the German motherboard site. We have an hour, and approximately it'll be 30 minutes us talking, and then we hope to open it up to you. And of course, we will also be talking about Macron leaks, possibly talking about how hacking might influence the upcoming German election campaign, or how it actually might not. I want to start, though, before we dive into these bit more current affairs-y things, I want to start talking about how hacking stuff is reported out. And me and Joseph talked about this before, that there's actually quite a bit of stuff that the public doesn't get to see that much and doesn't get to hear that much, or parts of the stories that are also important that the public doesn't get to hear that much about. So maybe we can start talking about what is the first thing you do when a hacker approaches you offering data, or when you find out there is a data somewhere to be reported on, possibly.
Yeah, so I mean, it'll start with all technology journalists, or most, probably should have a encrypted means of communication that you just make public. And you'll have that open whenever you're online. A hacker will just send you a message. Most of the time, obviously, they're going to be anonymous because they are a criminal, even if what they're doing is highlighting corruption or malpractice or whatever it might be. They'll send you a message, maybe chat for a bit, and then they'll probably offer you some data. And that could be anything from, I mean, the scale of the Panama Papers, down to something maybe like a surveillance company was hacked or something like that, and emails and contracts and that sort of thing. But the vast majority, at least in my experience, will be emails and passwords of some crappy porn website that had rubbish security and got hacked. They'll offer to send you the data, and you'll figure out a way to transfer that information while protecting the privacy of the victims of the hack. Again, if it's a porn website or a dating website, you certainly want to protect the privacy and integrity of that data. Once you've actually obtained it, it really depends on what the actual data contains. If it is just login details for a website, you may go and try to create an account on the site, and then you can't, because that email address is already registered. That gives you a good idea of that data actually belongs to that website. And even this early on, you have to be incredibly skeptical and aware of potential fakes. I mean, I guess I could probably quantify it that something like 35–40% of the data dumps I receive are wrong. They actually come from a different website, or the hacker is bullshitting and just trying to get their underground street cred, whatever it might be. So you have to assume almost the data is fake until you have actually managed to verify it in some way.
Okay, so we're at the very first important step, which is verification, I guess. Can you go a bit into detail how you verify data?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, if it's just email addresses, you can figure that out. And then it may just be as simple as contacting victims of the data breach. A lot of the time, people are going to be quite happy that you've told them, because presumably they don't know, and the victim company doesn't know either. So you're actually helping them by informing them, and you write them a very nice, friendly Not scary email saying, hey, sorry, I have your password and all your personal information. I'm a good guy, I'm not going to do anything with it. And yeah, a lot of the time they're happy. Other times they will get very scared, justifiably, and maybe inform the company, and that could actually jeopardize your report because then the company knows before you're ready for them to be aware of it. But the vast majority of the time, people never reply, which is fine. There's a lot of luck in data breach verification. But if you can't contact the victims, maybe it's more contractual data. You'll maybe try to cross-reference it with public information. Maybe there is a contract between a hacked bank and an insurance provider, which is a real case we did with a Los Angeles investment firm.
Sorry if I may just jump in. Maybe to make it a bit more concrete, could you give an example, maybe talking about the recent FlexiSpy story, when you talk about contacting victims, like how do you go about that?
Yeah.
And maybe we should also mention that FlexiSpy is a spyware developer primarily marketing its tools as a cheap way of surveilling targets, which they claim would be used in legal cases, which we actually found in a lot of cases it's ex-partners cheating on each other or spouses being cheated on.
So as Max said, there's this company called FlexiSpy in Thailand. It will sell anybody who wants it a piece of software to install on your phone or a target's phone that can intercept phone calls, emails, text messages, photos, remotely switch on the microphone, remotely switch on the camera, and this isn't a government or some sort of surveillance contractor. It's what anybody can buy for $50. Ironically, they were hacked, and we were sent several gigabytes of data, including their customer lists. So that's where the verification comes in. We contacted these people saying, hey, sorry, did you use FlexiSpy? And considering that what they were actually doing is clearly illegal, certainly under like US law, people did reply and say, yes, that is my data, yes, I'm a customer, and yes, I used it to spy on my wife.
How many would be replying? Percent, are we talking 10, 20?
I emailed maybe 150 FlexiSpy customers and I got about 4 responses. So it's minuscule.
Not a lot.
Yeah.
Germans were a bit more happy to talk. I emailed like 1,300 and I got like 50 replies.
Yeah, well, I guess in proportion.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the same with any other data breach. People aren't keen to chat necessarily. But I was surprised by how many people wanted to talk about that.
Yeah. Okay, so talking about verification, what is the next step then? Or maybe just because you mentioned there's hackers out there for street credit stuff. What do you do if someone clearly bullshitted you and you verify that he bullshitted you? Do you let him know? Do you just cut off contact?
You try not to be rude, but like, hey, that data you sent me is not legitimate, or you try to press them for more information because maybe I was wrong, maybe I screwed up with verification somehow, but then usually when you confront them, they'll just stop replying to you because they realize they've been caught. But yeah, you certainly go back and you try to get more information from the source, just in case you are wrong, but most of the time when you've verified that a data breach is not legitimate, you're typically right. Yeah.
So you have a data breach now, you have the data, you verified it, it's correct. Have there been situations where you haven't run a story then? Or what is the judgment then to move on to...
Well, when one was correct.
So you have a correct set of data. What's the judgment now, the course of action?
Yeah, I mean, we get a lot of gaming companies, like forums for... I don't know, not World of Warcraft, but something like that, right?
Yeah.
Like a free version. And here are 2 million accounts, and we verified they're real, but in the end we didn't run a piece because it's such a miscellaneous website. I mean, even though we're talking about this and almost treating it like it's this whole new thing and it's, only the 21st century or something, at the end of the day, it is just like normal journalism. If something isn't going to be a good story or of enough interest to readers, we're not going to run it, even if the data is real.
Okay, so you said mostly the hackers you are in contact with would remain anonymous, obviously. So a next
Or like under a nickname.
under a nickname.
Yeah.
So a next important step would be attribution, which is also a classical journalistic tactic, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk about how you go about that.
I mean, more often than not, it doesn't really matter where the data came from. At least when I'm talking about the very general, a porn website was hacked or a gaming website was hacked, whatever. Like, it will come from a data trader or maybe a data collector. There are people who just collect emails and passwords because they want it for their own personal use. Or it might be the hacker as well. In those cases, it doesn't really matter who it was. You can attribute it to crazy hacker 69 or whatever, but whether you actually include that or not doesn't always factor. It changes when you're dealing with something that has political significance or a much greater public interest, such as the FlexiSpy stuff or the DNC hacks, and then obviously the French email dump as well. But it really depends on the story rather than the source, if you see what I mean. And then that comes in later, yeah. It's case by case.
Let's talk about the DNC hack. Let's remain with that story for a minute, because and I want to bring you in as well, Thomas, because I know that has been a case where you dug deep into data and actually looked at attribution. Can you tell us why you started that, and then how you went about that, and why that was interesting and important for you to do attribution there?
Well, but just to make sort of a very important distinction here, there are these the leaks that Joseph was describing, where you have customer information, sometimes login information, sometimes including addresses and maybe credit card numbers in some cases. And the interesting thing there is that people have an account at, say, Ashley Madison. That's the story itself. But what you don't often have in these kinds of leaks is the actual content of emails or of file sharing sites or something like that. So it's very superficial as a leak in terms of its content. But then, of course, there are these political leaks that came to prominence mainly last year in the American election, where individuals' emails accounts were hacked, and all the information downloaded, gigabytes of information downloaded, and then made publicly accessible. That, of course, makes it interesting because you can look at John Podesta's risotto recipe and other information,
which is clearly the public interest,
clearly
and
public
everyone should know about it.
Because you've written a piece for Motherboard and you've done research into this where you collected evidence and you tried to attribute. What sort of maybe balancing act was that there? Why did you have to remain cautious? When did you feel comfortable calling stuff out?
So if you have a leak that is clearly put out there for political effect, and in the case of an election campaign, we saw that just on Friday evening with the Macron leak. We saw it in 2016 with 80 separate leaks, roughly 80 separate leaks that were related to the American campaign, election campaign. If something like that happens, then of course the question of attribution, which as Joseph pointed out, isn't so interesting necessarily if you look at a large data credentials dump. The attribution question becomes very important because who is trying to achieve a political effect? And then of course the next question is, how do you achieve attribution? What do you do? That's what I've been doing.
What do you do? What did you do in that case?
Well, if you have a major breach of a network, in the case of the Democratic National Committee, which is essentially the Democratic Party, it's like here in a German context, as if the Christian Democratic Party headquarters would get hacked, or the SPD or something. They had an actual network breach. Somebody broke into the network, like breaking into a building, and then they needed to move around in the network and take information out. And just like in a physical burglary, if somebody breaks into a building, you need tools to get in. You would need sort of like a vessel to carry stuff out, and then you would need a car to drive away. You have the equivalence of these things in a digital environment as well. So you can look at similarities. Where was that exact tool used? In which other burglary was the same tool used? So we found, for instance, that the same tool that was used to hack the the tool that was used to hack the DNC and the hack of the German parliament, of the Bundestag, used the same command and control IP address. This is the equivalent of a getaway car in a burglary, if you like, in order to exfiltrate content. And that is then a meaningful forensic link between the two.
Maybe let's talk about the hacker in the cases of tampering in the U.S. election process as well. Because with Guccifer 2, there have been several interviews and people speculating about his identity or the identity of that group. Why would it be important in that case who the hacker is and to talk to him or her or them?
I mean, in that case with the DNC, and you had this character on Twitter calling themselves Guccifer 2.0. Guccifer was a Romanian hacker who attacked various US systems and politicians, and he was trying to give the image that, oh, I'm a Romanian hacker too, and I'm hacking the DNC because they're corrupt or whatever it may be. That facade fell pretty quickly when our colleague Lorenzo tried to speak to him in Romanian, and the guy just was clearly using Google Translate, doing all of these sorts of mannerisms that you wouldn't have in a natural-speaking Romanian. But the reason why that attribution and that source is important is because Guccifer 2 didn't just dump the emails and that was it. He was actively going to journalists, say from The Hill, which is a kind of conservative website, and saying, hey, here's something that you will like, here's something your readers will like, you should definitely cover this. Or they go to Politico and try to push the same thing. So this source clearly has a motivation, not just behind dumping the emails or even just hacking in the first place, but pushing a certain media agenda. And that just became increasingly important and salient as the campaign went on. It wasn't just a normal data breach.
So you're saying it's actually important to point out if a hacker has a political agenda, it's something that should be included in articles and publications, or is a publication all right as well who just uses the data dump and writes about the stuff in the data, or at what point is that important to include? Just also going back to kind of the title that we gave this session.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, and I'd probably say in the DNC hack, the high likelihood that it was Russia is actually more important than what was in the emails, like John Podesta's risotto recipe or something that nobody would or should care about. Who leaked that data was much more important than the actual information itself. And as Max mentioned, this panel is called How to Report a Hack Without Becoming a Puppet. And maybe unwittingly, or maybe because, to be honest, they just didn't care, plenty of members of the US media did become puppets, likely for the Russian regime, just by reporting on the documents that Guccifer was feeding them and just going along with that and not always pointing out that, hey, by the way, this is likely a Russian operation. I mean, even if you're not going to do a piece just by itself saying, hey, the Russians are doing this, you may want to include, I don't know, at least 2 sentences that, by the way, this probably came from the Russians, if you actually have the evidence to back that up. Because, I mean, ultimately, we're trying to make readers more informed. And if you're missing that context, it's kind of a superficial article, and you're probably doing actually a disservice to your reader and to journalism more broadly.
Well, maybe if I can sort of add some historical comparison to what Joseph just said. If you look at disinformation campaigns during the Cold War, and there were many. There were literally thousands of disinformation campaigns during the Cold War. I'll make one example. In the late 1950s, from between 57 and 60, the KGB, sometimes with a bit of help from later Stasi, was doing a campaign of hate mail against French officials in the Alsace-Lorraine region, which was formerly part of Germany. So they tried to fan the flames of neo-Nazi anti-Semitism in that region through letter-writing campaigns, threat letters. And in that context, even assassinated one person, which was quite an extraordinary thing to do. But if you look at this disinformation campaign, historically, it was very labor-intensive. They really had to sit down, write a proper letter, think about what they would write first, make it look credible, write it with a typewriter that is not suspicious, organize the mailing across the Iron Curtain, that kind of thing. Today, So basically, you can say that disinformation in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and later was artisanal. You really had to invest hard handiwork to make it happen and be successful. Today, it's more industrial in the sense that you can hack information at scale, put it into the public domain, and then the journalists of the actual victim country will create the value of the disinformation campaign. That's completely new.
So are you saying that hacking as part of the electoral process and election campaigns is likely not going to go away, or is it ever going to go away? Is it going to become more? Do we know? We obviously don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. It's so far we've seen a number of campaigns like in the DNC and wider hacks in the United States. It's a very easy thing to pull off. It's not a difficult operation to do, because people always make some people will always make mistakes. So you will get through in the case of some accounts, and it will be possible to exploit that information. But it's early days. We don't know. It's going to be much harder in Germany, I think, to exploit the political situation in Berlin and Germany come September, because 2016 already happened. Mm-hmm. We're having this discussion today because we understand there's a real problem. Macron realized there's a real problem on Friday. The French have understood the problem. So I think it's more difficult to do this again because we are alert, thankfully.
Let's talk about the Macron leaks situation late Friday night. Would you agree that the different reporting was also in part because the French media were watching the DNC situation, the DNC hack, or has that only to do with the media blackout that is supposed to happen 48 hours before that?
Yeah, there's a few things. For those that don't know, on Friday, somebody posted onto Pastebin and the Internet Archive, I think, a selection of either the emails or the links to the emails stolen from the Macron campaign, whereas US journalists with the DNC hack just jumped on those emails and started reporting things. The timing of the dump came just an hour, I think, before French media were banned from reporting anything substantial about either presidential candidate. So you didn't have all the media pouring in for that reason. But second of all, to answer your question, yeah, I think that the French media must have been following the DNC and then seeing the fallout from that. And then there was the French paper Le Monde posted an update in several of their articles saying that we may report on these emails if there is something interesting in them, if there's real scandal, but we are not going to write to the schedule of an anonymous hacker. So they went out of their way to actually say we are not going to be a puppet for whoever is behind this email dump. So I clearly think there's lessons learned from that, yeah.
Just to point out something to make this a little more human. I mean, maybe there are some people in the room who have worked on a campaign, on a political campaign, or have done some sort of activism. It doesn't have to be on a political campaign. I've spoken with a few people on the Clinton campaign, just after the hacks, after the leaks came out. And this was really personal for them, because every single day for the entire month of October, a new leak came out. And the leaks contained personal, information about relationships within the campaign, sometimes private information. You had people had their children threatened and sometimes harassed. So it really was an emotional drain on just work. So people had to check the WikiLeaks, instead of actually getting their work done, because of course people would talk about this kind of thing with them. So we shouldn't underestimate the emotional impact of a leak like this hitting the public domain.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, one of the things that journalists need to bear in mind when actually reporting on these hacks. What you leave out is just as important as what you actually include. I mean, during the Sony hack and all of the emails dumped online, I think it was Gawker or Gizmodo, sorry, I can't remember, but someone reported that a certain celebrity dyes their pubic hair or something completely private, that a newspaper just shouldn't be running. I mean, when you get this email dump, you don't suddenly have an obligation to report every single little nugget so you can get some traffic for your website. You still have to go, does the public actually need to know this? And that balance between public interest and an invasion of privacy is even more intense when gigabytes of information are dumped online for anyone to look through. And because anybody can look through it, it's not just professional journalists or training journalists, it's members of the public or security researchers who may not subscribe to the same sort of values that you do with balancing that privacy and that public interest. So it can really affect private individuals, yeah.
So, but let me ask you, if I may, both of you, because you're both journalists, a question. So I'm currently doing a lot of historical research into disinformation. And in the early 1970s, Stasi, here in Berlin actually, intercepted a phone call between then Helmut Kohl and one of his CDU officials called Biedenkopf, and it became a scandal. Stasi intercepted this phone call, camouflaged it as an American intelligence operation, and gave it to a German magazine called Der Stern. Now, it was pretty clear that something was wrong with this. Either it was an American intelligence leak or a Stasi intelligence leak. Der Stern very clearly understood at the time. What would you have done? Would you have published, knowing that this is an intelligence operation, or would you not?
Do you want to go first?
I can go first.
Right.
Well, I would have looked at the information, obviously, first, tried to verify, and then try to evaluate what the public interest is. And if it turned out to be of public interest, and also if it turned out that there's no personal intimate data affected or leaked or told in the story that shouldn't be, that make sure that that is redacted, then run with the story, but also include the knowledge, as Joseph said before, that that story is just as important as the original situation between Helmut Kohl and Kurt Biedenkopf and the stuff they discussed. So I would have also included everything that we know, and maybe we could only have said allegedly or supposedly an intelligence campaign, but even that, or investigate more and then only publish when you know what you can say about that the way that information was produced or was sent to you.
Yeah, I'm largely the same. If we're going on the premise that the intercepted communication is of public interest, you're going to publish it probably regardless of whether you know it came from an intelligence operation or not. Let's say it's in the public interest and you don't know it's from an intel operation. Yep, fine, go ahead, you can claim ignorance. If you do have that suspicion, yeah, you probably would include, but important, it wouldn't stop publication. And I think that's what we've learned with the DNC leaks, that even if you do hedge it and say, yes, this is likely a Russian campaign, that doesn't mean journalists are going to, and they shouldn't, well, we're not going to publish this information, because there is still stuff in the public interest in there.
What is in the public interest, looking at the Macron leaks, how would that story develop, or what stories would you guys find interesting to see, read? What leads should journalists follow now?
I mean, it's apparently not what's actually in the emails, because it just looks like a load of garbage, really. I mean, the most interesting thing that came out was a clearly faked invoice from someone from the campaign buying a load of methamphetamine on the dark web, and that was obviously completely fabricated. So if that's the most interesting thing in the email dump isn't the story, right? It's why this is happening. Yeah. So I think, as we mentioned earlier, there are a few, plenty of research groups that are digging into this, and hopefully they'll release more information about who was behind this attack and maybe the reasoning why. But even on a broader public interest level that isn't just about journalists, it's more about, hey, we're seeing a pattern here, and now we can plan and react for when it could well happen with the Germans or even the UK snap election that's just been called. So that's probably in the greater public interest, that people are actually learning from these operations.
What about the interesting or kind of strange story told in that tweet that went viral, that the Macron election campaign actually outsmarted the hackers? Someone, I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact wording there, but it was something along that line. So the Macron campaign found out that's what that tweet implied, found out that they were being attacked or phished, and starting with that realization, they put in fake documents by themselves to tamper with the release. What do you make of that? And
I mean, so this tweet, which has been retweeted maybe 8,000, 9,000 times now, was saying, oh look, the Macron campaign released fake information to fool WikiLeaks. First of all, whether they actually release fake information themselves is debatable, and we need more reporting, but WikiLeaks doesn't even publish this data. I mean, there is very little doubt that WikiLeaks has been instrumentalized as a state weapon, but in this case, it wasn't. And doing tweets like that then gain traction, and then WikiLeaks has to respond, and all of this stuff, it just gives ammunition to the dogmatic critics who will never accept evidence it's Russia or whatever it may be. So that sort of thing is just as bad as so-called fake news, when people falsely accuse WikiLeaks of doing something bad as well.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I find it quite disturbing to see how quickly if a story like the Macron leaks story shows up and there's very significant media interest in it, people jump to conclusions extremely quickly. They don't look at the technical details. They don't look at the technically available forensic evidence or the absence of it, and just run with an argument that confirms their beliefs. That is certainly a trend that we see on social media, especially on Twitter, and I'm afraid that Twitter is not doing very much to give us tools to get that under control.
Let's maybe to wrap it up, to come to an end, to also open up to the audience. Let's talk about one last ongoing hacking story, the shadow brokers, and talk about how a lot of these stories gain traction and the cycle that they go through, which is the InfoSec community, which I think is something that is important to talk about. Maybe you can explain what the shadow brokers actually is, and talk about our latest release on Motherboard. And actually, we ourselves also relied on these researchers and had to correct stories. We ran wrong stories,
and we fucked up. But so the shadow brokers is a group. They call themselves hackers, but we don't really know what they are. They've repeatedly released tools from the NSA, so the NSA's actual toolkit for breaking into Windows systems or extracting data, whatever it may be. And then the recent one was a selection of very high-value exploits specifically for Windows. When the Shadow Brokers group tweeted out this material, it didn't just send it to a journalist or do it out in the open. It specifically sent the data publicly on Twitter to a cybersecurity researcher who has been digging through the previous leaks. So clearly whoever is leaking these NSA hacking tools was like, hey, they're paying attention and they're giving me legitimacy by verifying that the data is real. That's exactly what I need. Here you go. And we've been reporting on that, us and The Intercept and the Daily Beast, and everyone have been following that story pretty closely, except in this instance with the Windows ones, a few researchers said they were 0 days, which, to keep it short, is a more valuable sort of exploit because Microsoft doesn't know about it, so they can't fix it. That was wrong, and we went with the headline that they're 0 days. The Intercept and various other people did, and we had to correct our stories. Everybody screwed that one up, and we take blame for it, and we own our mistakes. But it also shows the dynamic that journalists have with the cybersecurity community, because we can't work with malware. We don't understand it, so we rely on people to do that. But sometimes we get that wrong as well.
Yeah, we're not malware researchers, I guess.
No.
And it also goes to show how complex the whole matter is, and again, how cautious you have to be when you jump to conclusions, I guess. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I would just make a very short observation. I mean, I'm an intelligence historian, and that's what I teach at King's College London. And in technical terms, I think what we saw in the shadow brokers is some high-tech spy shit happening in real time. What I mean by that is there are precedents in history for that for that kind of event. So, for instance, in the early 1960s, the KGB got their hands on highly classified U.S. Military documents, including nuclear targeting lists. They took these lists first. It was highly valuable intelligence in the early 60s, but after a few years, this particular piece of intelligence had lost its value because the Americans also knew it had been compromised. Then they flipped a switch and started to use it as what's called throwaway in the trade, meaning they would publish this information, make it public in order to embarrass the Americans. And they did this for years. They did it in Germany, they did it in the UK, and it worked. So I think what we're looking at here with shadow brokers may be the 21st century equivalent of that. Making intelligence that is actually not that valuable anymore, as we know, because many of these vulnerabilities have been patched, making it public in order to create an embarrassment effect.
Just to build on what you said, we may all suspect it was Russia behind the shadow brokers. I mean, that's probably a fair assumption. But nobody should be writing in an article, the shadow brokers are Russian, because we don't have the forensics evidence to back that up, which is different to the DNC case, where we certainly do have strong evidence. And
just to close, and the final observation, historically speaking, the attribution sometimes is very difficult. We have many cases of historical misattribution of operations. The CIA historically tended to overestimate Stasi for some reason and thought Stasi was behind more operations than it actually was. But important is, often you need a defector, somebody to come out and write his memoirs and mention specific operations in their memoirs in order to have certainty. And we don't have that today. So I fully expect us to remain in this gray space and this uncertain space for a long time in some cases. Mm-hmm.
Let's open up to you guys, to the audience. I guess we'll have a microphone going around, so if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and wait 1 second to get a microphone, or maybe 2 seconds as it's being catched from the back. Okay, and then up front here, please.
Thanks a lot for your talk. My name is Nicholas. I have a question with regard to the Snowden leaks. I was curious whether you could, when you can think back in time, how would you cover the story differently? So knowing how the story developed over time, what parts of the coverage from a journalistic perspective would you have changed? Thanks.
I think Snowden is obviously an exceptional case, because he made the decision himself to not remain anonymous. Presumably because that would leave open plenty of interpretations of, oh, this is a Russian op, or the Chinese hacked them, or whatever it may be. You know, he went out and owned it and said, this is what I'm releasing and this is in the public interest, and he clearly was absolutely right. So it's kind of hard to answer that, because the decision almost wasn't up to the journalists in a way, because Snowden came out and publicly said himself. And of course, I mean, The Guardian had the exclusive at the beginning, right, and everyone else just kind of had to follow. But saying that, as the Snowden coverage is carried on and dragged out, and people have certainly, I would say, lost interest in it, maybe the wider public has, it is good that whenever there is a story based on those documents, people are reminded this came from a whistleblower and not some third-party hacker. I mean, having that context throughout the coverage is pretty important, I think.
I think, can I say one thing before your question? I think something that we did not do, and we maybe should have done, is to also differentiate between hacking, leaks, and whistleblowing. I mean, I guess I hope came through that we don't assume this all to be the same, but it's very different situations and very different evaluations that you have to make. So the Snowden one again is a very exceptional one to the other ones. Yeah. Please.
Yeah, so my question, I guess, is for Max and Joseph. Because both of you guys have worked a lot on hacks and material as sources for your stories that came from basically result of a crime. And after the cases that we've had with Barrett Brown and now Ben Marcouch kind of facing issues for their interactions with their sources, my question is, have you ever, in your experience, been approached by authorities because of your kind of communication and relation to some degree with your source being a hacker or like someone that just committed a crime? And how much of that is a concern to you as a possibility if it didn't happen, and whether that affects the way that you conduct your reporting, knowing the origin of the information?
Yeah, I've been approached by law enforcement a few times. I covered the Ashley Madison hack, which was a dating site in 2015, I think it happened. I interviewed the hackers, and then the FBI wanted to have a phone call, and so did Toronto police, because it was a Canadian company. I took the phone call, and they asked for the hacker's email address, which I used to communicate with them, and I obviously politely declined. If they want to get that, they can get a subpoena or a warrant. Even if your source is a criminal, as Claudio said, in all of these cases, or the vast majority, they are going to be criminals in some way or another. Regardless, they are a source. So if it's a hacker, a federal agent, a paedophile, in some of my other stories as well, a source is a source is a source, and you should treat them all with the same respect and take the security of each one as seriously as everyone else.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I have not been contacted by law enforcement yet on any of the stories, and yeah, I guess I would talk to them as well. But if they were asking for any information on the source, I would also decline. I want to point out some German-specific situation, which is being, or there is a Verfassungsklage, so there is a prosecution at the German Supreme Court, Bundesverfassungsgericht. There is a pretty terrible law being passed called Datenhehlerei. I'm afraid I wouldn't know the translation. But along a lot of other stuff that it covers, it basically could mean that journalists and also bloggers, which would be people like Netzpolitik, which might for some people be considered bloggers in a court case, can be prosecuted for passing on information, and it might it's a very vague formulation, but it might include that. For example, if I were to pass something to Joseph, then I could be prosecuted for Datenhehlerei, which can be 2.5 years, 3 years, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, I don't know the exact number, but it's a very high number. So we haven't seen any case where that has been used, and it's a pretty new law, and we will see how it will develop. But just on a more broader scale, I think we have to remain very alert to any legalization being passed when it comes to internet regulation in general that might tamper with a journalist's possibility to communicate with sources.
But I mean, just to give some more practical advice, whenever you're communicating with a hacking source, you can get quite friendly with them, and you talk a lot, and typically it's going to be 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever, because that's when people chat. But you have to always make sure to remain in a journalistic role. I mean, you'll never ever tell them, oh, you're in this company, can you maybe go find this specific information in the server? Because then you're an accomplice, and you could be criminally prosecuted for that. I mean, you can only ever ask them to give you data if they have already retrieved it. And then, of course, always act under the assumption that even if you're on an encrypted chat, just assume that a federal law enforcement official is going to see that at some point, because time and time again we see when hackers are caught or dark web drug dealers are caught, someone on the other end was logging the conversation. Maybe they wanted that so they can get leverage over someone else when they can do a plea deal, or maybe they're just an idiot and they left logging on their Pigeon client or whatever it may be. But always assume that whatever you're doing is going to become public and always stick within the law. And maybe the hackers will think you're a fucking nerd for doing that and like not very cool or whatever, but you have to do it because you could have cases like Barrett Brown or whatever, who arguably maybe got a little bit too close with the community that he was covering, and maybe that's why it kind of led to it.
I think we have a question over there.
Hi, this is kind of a follow-up question or comment, but Mr. Ripp, maybe you remember it. I think last year, Peter Neumann, your colleague at King's College, who is also director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, I think they have been actually not been just contacted friendly by the security authorities, but they have been raided, and I think they took away computer hardware because they were doing research on foreign fighters and were in contact with them. And I think the UK authorities passed a law which allowed actually the security authorities to take these computers. So maybe this is a comparable case. So maybe you can comment on this, if you have any details.
I'd rather not comment on that case, also because I'm not familiar with the precise details. I wasn't in that research group at all. But just as a broader comment, when just a few weeks ago, the US government announced they would consider prosecuting WikiLeaks, Julian Assange. This is an interesting moment of truth because a lot of journalists who may politically disagree with WikiLeaks completely came forward in support of WikiLeaks and said, no, this is not acceptable. We should treat them, as a journalist, because if we don't, then we're entering the slippery slope and open the floodgates to forms of censorship and prosecution that we come to regret. So I think this is an interesting space to watch for the future.
The next question over here.
Hello there. I guess this is a sort of follow-up to the question before last about talking to sources who are hackers. Do you ever feel you have a duty of care towards your sources other than beyond keeping them anonymous? Say if someone has got in touch with you, especially some of these people who might feel they have a point to prove and they seem to be quite young or they might not understand the ramifications of their actions. Do you ever feel to say a word like you could be getting yourself into serious trouble here?
Yeah, I know what you mean. A lot of the sources that I and others deal with, even though they are anonymous or pseudonymous, it can become apparent that they're very young, and maybe later when they're arrested as well. I personally try to step a very fine line between reporting, working on material with them, and helping them. That being said, if someone who's clearly young and a hacker approaches me and they're clearly not used to talking to a journalist, I'm not just going to go, oh, ha, 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 this is great, I'm going to print whatever they say. I'm going to tell them, look, before we chat, if you want to do off the record, this is how it works, this is how background works, and this is how on the record works. So they don't accidentally say something that's totally incriminating, and then it's on the website, and then they get an indictment. I don't feel like that's me crossing a line. And you would do the same maybe if you were talking to a source at a protest, maybe, and they were an activist at a particularly politically sensitive protest, and you might want to have an off-the-record conversation, but they've never dealt with the media, so they don't really understand how that works. You'd probably do the same thing there as you would to a young hacker. But then maybe when it comes to trying to put them on the right path or something like that, personally, and this isn't like an art, it's not a science, it is very difficult and very murky, but I personally wouldn't say, hey, maybe you should be using your skills for good, or whatever it may be, because I don't think that is my role to say that.
Yeah, I agree. No, sorry.
We need a fight.
Yeah, no. It can be a bit strange when you realize that a person on the other end is maybe not realizing what they're doing, and I personally try to be as reserved as possible and I guess I can say it kind of annoys me as well, because it's a strange situation where you see someone is apparently doing something they might regret at some point, and it's like that. Those situations are the situations where I take a lot of time to reply and think about what I would say. And yeah, this can be totally unrelated to story and to attribution and verification and stuff we talked about before. But yeah, that can be part of the job as well. I mean, it's definitely not. I try to be very reserved and not. No.
I mean, and then even if you did tell the hacker, oh, this isn't what you should be doing. I mean, that's pretty arrogant of the journalist to say that. No, you should be doing this because I'm right. I think it'd be very patronizing and arrogant of the journalist to do that in quite a lot of contexts.
Maybe just as a quick comment from the other end, so to speak, oftentimes it's the journalist who gets played by the source. That can be, just normal politics. It can sometimes in a business context that can happen quite easily as well, and of course with intelligence sources it can also happen. It can even happen to academics. Sometimes you even notice when it happens. But I think important is not to be naive and to think that you are sort of the objective outsider who understands it all, because that's certainly not the case.
So, any more questions? Oh yeah, over here.
First, I really appreciate the sort of current and historical perspective that you've put on this panel. And for Thomas, I guess we live in this moment right now where technologically a lot of people like to say either it's completely new and novel and we've never been in a moment like this before, or that this is we've done all this before, there's all these things, here are all these examples that we've lived through that are exactly like they are today. Just from your perspective, looking both at today and before, if you could sort of pick one from each of those that you do think is sort of either unique or really notably like a lesson we should be remembering from before, either one or both of those, I would just love to hear your take on that.
On the differences, you mean?
As in like something today that is novel and unique, and or a lesson learned from before that we should really remember today, based on where we are right now.
Well, I'll bring up a subject that is certainly controversial, and I'll try to do it in an aggressive way also. I think Twitter is shamefully failing as a social media company to meet its political responsibility. Twitter, and this is new, this we haven't seen in the past, Twitter is making it not just possible, it's making it easier today than it was 1 year ago for disinformation operators to run an effective disinformation campaign and clean up the public domain afterwards. And let me just spell that out so that those who are a little more technical understand what I'm talking about. In 2016, Twitter changed its API policy, which governs the flow of large volumes of data from Twitter to other companies, third-party providers of intelligence products, for instance. If you run an automated a bot on Twitter right now, or if you run 50 bots on Twitter, which you easily can do, you can hide them in the noise, and then after you run an operation with them, you can delete the bots. And Twitter is now enforcing across all third-party providers that they will also delete tweets retrospectively in their own databases. So you can't even research, looking back to 2016, how automated accounts abused Twitter as a disinformation platform, if you like, in the US general election. In my mind, that is absolutely scandalous, and it's also new.
So for example, just to maybe add why it's important, tried to get at that before, but I guess didn't have the time, why it's important to talk about the responsibilities of the platforms and the surroundings where these stories develop, like the InfoSec community and the platforms, the different platforms that they would use. One of the main stories, I guess, that was rightfully so, in my opinion, shared by a lot of people and talked about by a lot of people, is how